This is Bonjour Chai, the As It Happens but for Judaism edition. I'm Avi Feingold in Montreal, and I'm here with Ilana Zakon in Toronto. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's podcast, we have the pleasure of hosting Mishy Harman of Israel Story, which is set to launch its new season, and Josh Lieblein will help us understand the People's Party of Canada. So, Ilana, we're out of Rosh Hashanah. We're on to Yom Kippur.
Yeah.
How was in-person services for you?
It was actually really nice. When we showed up there, because I went to like an outdoor service at the shul that I went to, they had like 5 or 6 different minions, some indoors, some outdoors. So ours was in a parking lot in a tent. And it was really packed within the tent itself. Some people were wearing masks. We kind of took a couple chairs, put them out of the tent under some trees to get a little bit of space. But it was the first time in so long that I'd been around so many people. And it felt really heartwarming. Like it felt like some semblance of normalcy. I can't even speak. I'm just waking up. I feel like I ate so much over the last few days that my system is just like a giant piece of brisket or something. That's where I'm at.
I think this is why we have the fast of Gedalia, which is observed the day after Rosh Hashanah to like purge all cleanse. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting going back to, I mean, I've been going to like services, but like daily services or Shabbat where you never
There's
get
probably
more
less
30,
people, right?
40 people, a lot less people. And there was probably, they did 2 services here back to back so that they can get up to 250 people in each service. Plus they had an outdoor tent with the music, with the service piped in without a live person. So the people who didn't want to be outdoors but wanted to be part of a service felt like they were there. I blew a ton of shofar for a lot of people in a lot of places.
Oh,
go
nice.
on tour. You go.
Do you have like a record of how long your Tekiah Gedola is? Do you know?
It's been, I mean, not anymore. I used to be much better at it. I when I was in my youth, I can get a good 20 seconds going, but I'm not Mr., super. I don't do the circular breathing techniques that all the saxophone players can play for minutes at a time. I'm not the Miles Davis of the shofar. I'm passable.
Okay, we'll take it.
It was really, I have to say, it was interesting, both from like a congregant and realizing how interesting it is to like be part of a large service the way you were saying, and also realizing how much can be skipped and still feel like a real service. Like a lot of people were like, because the whole Musaf service took an hour and a half with the shofar, and usually it takes literally twice as long. And people were like, well, why can't we do this every year?
Right.
I think that people are going to want to have this notion of like, well, why can't we make it a bit shorter in future years?
I don't think they shortened it. Yeah, where I was, I don't think they shortened it. It was long.
Interesting. Well, it wasn't. I mean, they had the early service for like the real hardcore people that started at 7:30, and then at 9:30 they invited like the people who just wanted the shofar and the musaf and stuff like that.
Right. Oh, that's a smart idea.
Although I have to say, and this is like really following up when we were talking about last week. There are people that I realize, and I'd been talking to them because they were outside, or I went to blow shofar for them, which was totally like a beautiful thing to do. And I'm realizing that there are people that, even though services are limited in number, they're requiring you to have 2 vaccinations. You have to have a mask on, and they're making sure that everything was done absolutely properly. And there's still people that don't want to have those services, and there are people having outdoor services, and there's still people that are still feeling afraid. And it started like, I don't know what to say about these people. And I was trying to make some sort of an equivalency, and I'm not sure it's a total equivalency, but help me out here. Like, we had a hard time, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, with the people that were willing to do anything and make all sorts of risks just so they can go to services.
Right.
I don't know what to say about the people that are not willing to have any risk at all, right?
What do you mean?
Will not go to. Meaning, there are people that are not going to take even a 2% risk.
Oh, like they're just not going to show up.
They're not going to show up, and I'm like, I keep saying, what can we possibly do that will allow certain people to come? And I'm trying to not make that equivalency. But if there are people that are willing to risk everything, and then there are people that are willing to risk 0, right? I think that there's something there that like you have to live, and the same way we have to tell people that like you have to have your health right? And don't risk your life in the middle of the beginning or in the early stages of the pandemic. We don't know anything. Now that we know so much and we've made all of these mitigating factors to allow people to come to services, and you still won't come, I think that says something about your spiritual life and where you value it.
I mean, I don't know if it's for us to make those kind of judgments. I feel like it's a very personal decision. And I mean, I guess it depends on what denomination you're from too, because if you're not Orthodox and you're okay using a computer on Yontif, then there are lots of online streaming services from what I've heard, right?
For sure. But the people that don't, and then there are people like that are still not coming to services.
Yeah. I
You
don't
know,
know.
like,
I don't think it's up to us to make those decisions for
but then
them.
why didn't we say that in the other side with the like ultra Orthodox communities that were having services when nobody else was doing it, and say, well, it's not for us to make the decision. They want
Yeah,
to
but
live
that's a health
spiritual
risk.
life.
That's different.
So this like the health risk is so minimal, you might as well not cross the street, right? If you're,
I think that's a little bit of an over exaggeration.
at what
It's hard
point?
to compare
I mean,
the two extremes because one is like completely disregarding the rules entirely, to generalize, and then this is
and one is
people who are
disregarding
maybe feeling
science, where the
hesitant.
scientists are saying,
Sure.
yeah, that they're just as hesitant in the other direction, and they're not listening
Right.
to the scientists and the public health people that are saying this is safe.
It's okay. Fair enough. I don't know. It's really hard to say. Like, I haven't really encountered many of those people. So have you? Have you had conversations with people who don't feel
Yeah.
comfortable? And what are they saying?
Yeah.
Like, what are the reasons for them?
They're like, it's not safe for me. It's not. There's still COVID in the air. There's still like, it's still risky. I don't feel comfortable. They're afraid. There's a lot of paranoia that got
Yeah.
drilled into people from the early days that they aren't willing to let go of, and I think you have to like, the Quebec health minister wrote us a letter. My wife was telling me about it because she's the president of the Board of Rabbis, and he was basically saying, listen, COVID is here to stay, and we have to learn to live with it and not, totally, we have to move on with our lives. And if we're not going to move on with our lives, then our spiritual lives are going to be just as bereft as the retail and the restaurant industries and the arts industries. And we have to encourage people to say, this is safe. You should be coming.
When you were going to services, did you require proof of vaccination to sign up?
Yeah.
Or take a test
absolutely.
or anything?
I didn't have to take a test, but you had to upload your proof of vaccination.
Right. I heard about a service that was happening in like a small shul in Thornhill where they actually made you take one of those quick tests before even going to the service.
I'd be okay with that.
But at the service that I went to, because I didn't buy my own ticket, I just showed up there and nobody asked any questions. I am double vaccinated, but there could have been people who weren't, who just said that they were. So I understand a bit of the hesitation, and there is like the strain. I'm not saying that I wouldn't go, but I understand, and I don't think it's up to us to push people to do things they're not comfortable with. And hopefully with time, as the cases do really lower, because we are seeing another wave happening, I think it's reasonable that some people are feeling hesitant.
Yeah, it's me, I'm always pessimistic, and I'm always willing to like have the contrary take. This is my like, I don't know, we have to rethink this, and we have to speak to those people that are really just as much on the other side, because if you're not living your life, then it's similar to me to like living your life too much and willing to say to do anything for God, right? If you're willing to do nothing for God and spirituality and your faith and your traditions and whatever, you gotta rethink some of those priorities also. But that's just me. Anyways, before we get to the election, let's hear from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Atelier Lou Bijouterie in Montreal, Quebec. Atelier Lou specializes in watches and custom design jewelry, along with a curated selection of designer jewelry. Visit us online or in person, and Eric Goldberg will help make your jewelry dreams come true. Atelier Lou is offering a promo code for all Bonjour High listeners using BON18 at checkout for 10% off your order at atelierlou.com.
So Maxime Bernier's People's Party has been seeing a bit of a bump in numbers over the past week or so, and here to help us make sense of this is our own Josh Lieblein. Josh, Welcome back to the program. I am coming back from 2 days of radio silence from Rosh Hashanah. What have I missed in the world of the Canadian election so far?
Well, Avi, you have a good excuse for sleeping on this. The rest of the Canadian punditry doesn't. But it looks like out of nowhere, Maxime Bernier's PPC, the People's Party of Canada, is making a bit of a late-breaking shift into the high single digits, sometimes over 10% in some polls. And I wanted to come on and talk a bit about what this may mean for the Jewish community, because there's the PPC does have a bit more in common with the Jewish community than you may think.
How so?
In what way? Can you expand on that?
Well, I mentioned one PPC candidate last week, David Freiheit, in your writing, and the PPC is kind of picked up a lot of the Green vote that has actually been collapsing recently. So they're kind of re-emerging as the preeminent protest party vote. And they may end up with a couple of seats the same way that the Greens did before the last election. So we know that the Greens have been the party that has been focused the most, ironically, on Jewish issues. They have a Jewish leader, and the Israel issue has consumed them. But with the PPC, it's going to be a little bit different because they're a bit more populist, a bit more Trumpy, and the same sort of thinking that applied to the Trump years may actually be coming up here.
I mean, by saying that, you're kind of implying the massive racism and xenophobia that comes out of the PPC. I saw these flyers that were going around Thornhill. Aren't you? You're in Thornhill, Ilana, no? Have you seen these flyers?
Yes.
I have not seen these not flowers, flyers. I have not.
Josh,
Enlighten me.
tell us about these flyers and what's going on with all of this.
Well, one thing I want to make clear is that it's not clear that these flyers actually did come from the PPC. It does compare the Thornhill PPC candidate, Mr. Samuel Greenfield, to Melissa, and it does kind of attack her on her supporting the LGBTQ agenda, whatever that is supposed to be. And they're talking about how the flyers were actually, if you were looking at them, you would have thought that they came from a sort of a more religious standpoint. Actually, I'm pulling them up on my phone so I can read what it says. Don't worry about vote splitting. Do what's right and send a strong message. Hashem runs the world. So, does that sound like something coming from the PPC? I'm not sure. They don't seem to be that much of a religious party to me. Could be some random person affiliated with the PPC or not. It's really hard to tell, but it's definitely right out of the populist playbook where they try to steal oxygen, as it were, by talking about hot button issues, attacking people, and trying to basically claim that there's some sort of agenda perpetrated against them. So while there's no proof that this was the PPC campaign who did this, I want to be very clear about that. It's not something that would be past them or their people to do.
How do you see this affecting things over the next week, if at all?
Well, you're going to see like the PPC has kind of crossed that threshold from being a cute little curiosity to something that's actually people are actually getting scared of. I have had dealings with Maxime Bernier. I actually ran into him at a CJ Pack action party. I wrote about it for one of my doorstop postings. So what you're going to get is a lot of, you might be hearing out of these people, if you haven't been listening already, some strange statements about how vaccine passports are like the Star of David that Jews would be forced to wear during Nazi Germany. And this is kind of ties into their whole idea that this is sort of segregating society. So that's the kind of like out there stuff you're going to hear from them.
Wow.
So you will be hearing more of that and focus on, like, for example, they have the well-known Prince of Pot, Mark Emery, is running for these guys in London, Ontario, and Mr. Emery's on record as calling Erwin Kotler a Nazi Jew because he happened to be the justice minister at the time. And I happened to have run into Mr. Emery and asked him about that. When I did that, he went into some sort of word salad rant talking about how Jews apparently couldn't plow a field or something. Just some really, really strange stuff going on there. But the thing about the PPC is I don't see them really having a massive breakthrough. I just see them overtaking the Greens and becoming the more protest party. You're going to see a lot of panicked writing about this in punditry. Now, having dealt with the PPC over a long period of time and actually been opposed to Maxime Bernier's leadership run in the CPC, I know who they are and I know what they traffic in, and mostly it's just grievance politics. I don't want to minimize the hateful stuff that they say from time to time, but they're just seizing on anything that will suck up oxygen in the room. So obviously you're going to say stuff to push your buttons and get a reaction.
So, I mean, look, if the PPC is the People's Party, Bernier, is so xenophobic, so hate-oriented, why do they seem to be constantly attracting so many Jews? Like, what's going on there?
I mean, this is what you were mentioning a little while ago, Avi. There are Jews who are still swing voters and who are upset with the way politics are being done. Bernier, I don't think he hasn't his Jewish bona fides are not that great. He hasn't said it's the same sort of appeal that many Jews had with respect to Trump and other populist parties. They don't feel represented by the mainstream Jewish community. They don't feel they're represented in mainstream politics. And so they go over to these fringe populist parties. They think that they can get some more influence there, that they can have more of a platform for people to hear whatever they have to say, even though the people in the party may not some of the people in the party may not be all that warm to Jews. It's no different from Jews who are affiliated with the Greens or the NDP.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can see how people who say vote your Hashem conscience wouldn't exactly go vote for the Greens, but it's really interesting to see them go for people that are affiliated with a party that talk about, or in Kotler as a Nazi, which totally boggles my mind. Anyways.
Yeah, the sort of the confusing. It's supposed to baffle rational, right-thinking people like yourself, Avi. It's supposed to make you, Ilana, have these big eyes like I saw you have over Zoom a little while ago. That's the intent. That's what people are doing.
Oh, many big eye reactions.
That's why I'm kind of used to it. So that's why I'm not as freaked out as it by people who aren't as familiar with it, because I know they're just trying to get a reaction. So that is why I try not to be as panicked, because that's what they want. They want to, quote unquote, trigger the libs. You may have heard that statement before. And so that's sort of like freaked out. Whoa, who are these guys? Like you've seen this with hate groups. They try to inflate their presence. They want to try to talk about how many followers they have on Twitter. They use social media that way, and that anonymity, and that way they can kind of like confuse and be like, whoa, makes them seem bigger than they actually are.
Yeah, no, I mean, being in Toronto for like 1 week now, I'm reading The Star every day because we actually get a copy of it with the relatives that I'm staying with. And I was reading an article, I think it was this morning or maybe yesterday, about how because of the pandemic, it's like bringing together, I think you touched on this before, all these different people who have a reason to like fell about things, like people who are like, I want my freedom, or, insert whatever complaint they have of choice about the pandemic. And now they're all kind of coming together and starting revolt. And it's crazy to me to see like a picture on the front of the Star, this woman with like no mask on, just like waving this anti-vax sign. I'm like, what kind of world do we live in? It feels like Back to the Future 2 or something, where everything's all messed up,
Yeah, and you're going to see a lot more of it over the next couple of days. You may see things actually cross the line to outright violence, and there are people talking about what we're going to do about these protesters that have been attacking the Prime Minister with throwing
with rocks.
And this being Canada, we never see things like this. So the fact that they're getting this reaction, the fact they have people like you scared, that's what they're going for. And they're not as concerned about what might happen as a result of this. And this is when things kind of go really off the rails like it did in Charlottesville or what have you.
Craziness. Who's our shadow Jewish candidate to watch out for this week?
Well, I haven't mentioned about her. I've kind of left the West Coast out a little bit. So I want to talk about Tamara Kronos. You might have seen her. She's running actually against Paul Manley of the Green Party. And anyone who's interested or has upset with what Mr. Manley has had to say about Israel might want to check out Ms. Kronos' campaign.
Very interesting. We will. All right. As always, Josh Lieblein, check out his doorstop postings on the CJN.ca, the new revamped CJN.ca. Always a pleasure to have you. And hopefully we'll see you we'll speak to you next week. And another CJN election business, I'll actually be hosting an election debate along with the host of the CJN Daily, Ellen Bessner, this Monday night, September 13th at 7:30 p.m. We will have candidates from all the major parties. We'll debate issues of importance to the Jewish community. You can actually record and submit a question online, and we may use it in the actual debate. To record your question and to register for this free online event, visit thecjn.ca/debate. When Mishy Harman started Sipur Israeli in 2013, he had no idea that not only would it spawn an English language version, but that it would become an international hit as well. The podcast is set to launch its 6th season, and with us to chat is Mishy himself. Mishy, welcome to the show.
Hi, Avi. Nice to be here. Thank you.
So the first thing I want to get into right away is the Canada, and especially Montreal, where I live, is very similar to Israel and Jerusalem in that it is very bifurcated in terms of the languages that we have. We have multiple languages. We have 2 languages in particular, English and French. And if you look at Montreal, the city is just as divided and split as Jerusalem in terms of people living in various places, in various sides of the city. Of course, there's not as much restrictions on that, but that's a different discussion. And there are completely different media empires, right, in terms of print media, TV, radio, film. How do you see the stories that come out in the English version of the podcast versus the stories that are being told in the Hebrew version? And what insights did that tell you about Israel and the people you're telling the stories about?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, the real analogy here would be to content in Hebrew and Arabic rather than Hebrew
Yes,
and English.
correct.
But since we don't produce, at least not yet, content in Arabic, I guess the next best thing is to talk about our Hebrew
How people tell
and
their
English show.
stories,
Right.
in English.
So when we began this show a decade ago, we wanted to essentially create an Israeli version of This American Life. The idea was to use the kind of storytelling and tools of journalism that This American Life use and apply them here in Israel, which is this extremely rich and diverse society, as you were saying. And we began. We started off. We didn't know really anything about radio, about podcasting. None of us came from this world. We were all doing other things, and in fact, there was really no podcasting scene in Israel. We were essentially one of the very first podcasts in the country, and the first one that became a national radio show. And early on, what we wanted to do was allow Israeli listeners to get to know other Israelis that they might not encounter or meet or have meaningful conversations with on any kind of regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were saying, we live in a very fragmented society, not only between Israelis and Palestinians and Jews and Muslims and Christians, but also within the Jewish community, between secular and religious and ultra-Orthodox and many other divides that exist. And what happens more often than not here, and I think this is probably true of almost anywhere, is that you surround yourself with people who are pretty much like you, people who went to the same schools or whose parents work in similar jobs or who live in the same neighborhoods. And as a result, it's not that you don't see members of other groups. You see them all the time because, after all, it's a small place. But the real interaction, any kind of deep interaction, is limited. And what happens more often than not is that you see someone belonging to a different social group on the street, and you immediately identify her or him, and you take in what they have or don't have on their head, or what clothes they're wearing, or what color skin they have, and you place them in a box or in a bucket, and you say, oh, well, that person is X.
Right.
And I know a lot about X, right? I know what that means to be X. I know what you have for dinner, and I know how many kids you have, and I know what you did or didn't do in the army, or what you think about the gay pride parade, or what party you vote for. And within a split second, we construct this entire narrative, this entire story in our mind about who that person is. And if I've learned one thing from doing this now for 10 years, it's how rarely that story is accurate. So what we tried to do with the Hebrew show early on was to allow listeners to do something that they don't get to do in real life, which is to listen to stories of people from other groups. And we thought that by eliminating the visual element, as one does with a podcast or radio show, we would give them this sort of grace period, a short grace period, maybe a minute, maybe 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if we're lucky, in which they wouldn't be able to pinpoint who that person they're listening to really is, and they'd actually listen. And once we started airing our show, that was exactly the reaction that we got from listeners again and again and again. It was variations on the theme of people would say, I'm 65 years old, I live in Yokneam, and last night while listening to Israel's story, to Sipur Israeli, was the very first time in my life that I actually heard the story of an ultra-Orthodox woman from Tzfat, or a Bedouin teenager from Hura, or a Russian immigrant who works as a night watchman at a parking lot in Ashdod, or whatever it is. So for us, that was tremendous, because we thought, well, we're allowing people to practice their muscle of empathy, something which we don't actually get to do very frequently.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It really is. I didn't even think of that as an aspect of podcasting, because I was going to ask, like, what makes it different, rather than doing it on TV as a documentary series. But I think your answer makes so much sense and is so necessary with everything that's going on. I'm curious, when you put out the English version, how did that affect the American listeners? Like, what kind of reactions did you get? Was it similar to the Israeli reaction?
So interestingly, several years later, we decided to start producing in English as well. And we thought that this was a piece of cake. We thought that this was, the easiest task yet, because we didn't have to, rewrite the stories. We already knew what the stories were. We just had to translate them. We had to go back to the same characters, to re-record. If the first time around we interviewed them for hours upon hours upon hours to sort of discover what the story was, now we already knew what the story was, and we almost knew what lines we wanted them to say, and we could. We're not actors here, so we weren't feeding them lines, but we could ask them questions that would elicit the exact answers that we wanted, and would be very easy. So we thought that this task was going to be a relatively simple one, and boy, were we wrong, because not only did we discover that stories change, and often change quite dramatically when people are telling them in a language which isn't their mother tongue, or even if they are fluent in English, just in another language. But also, we discovered that the kinds of stories that our audiences wanted to hear were quite different, and also the kind of stories that they didn't want to hear were quite different. And this is perhaps says something interesting about about American and Canadian audiences, and their perceptions of Israel and the kind of Israel that they want to encounter in listening to a show called Israel Story. We discovered early on that there was less tolerance. Israel Story is an apolitical show, meaning that we try our best to avoid being yet another voice in the cacophony of voices about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the occupation and stuff like that. It's not that we don't tell stories of Arabs or Palestinians. In fact, we tell a lot of stories of Arabs and Palestinians, but we try to make them human interest stories and not really about the political or geopolitical situation here. But at the same time, we realize that our listeners, and perhaps even I don't want to say this definitively because I'm not sure I have data to back this up, but I have a sense that Canadian listeners were even more so than American listeners, less interested in hearing stories that presented Israel in more critical light. I'm not now talking specifically about the occupation or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but just in general. I mean,
sounds about right.
There was a sense that people wanted a wholesome,
like a positive only.
They want you to be a tour guide and showing you how wonderful Caesarea is and how cute the falafel stand that everybody goes to is, and they wanted it to. The North American imagination of Israel, what you seem to be saying, is this, everybody dances the hora in the fields, all the chalutzim at night, and in the day they work the fields and they send us oranges. Right.
I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it. There are a lot of North American listeners who are extremely sophisticated about what's going on in Israel and have a very, very realistic view of what's going on here. And are there people who are stuck in some sort of, post 67 kind of fantasy? Of course. But I would say the majority of people are not. Still, one of our most popular episodes in English was a story that we told about the backstory of writing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, which here probably would have been seen as something a little bit out of touch with kind of we didn't
The
air
realities.
we didn't air it in Hebrew, that episode.
Interesting.
Because here, first of all, it's a pretty well-known story. Second of all, it might be seen a little bit as outdated or something like that. But in America, in America, or North America, I should say, I should be careful in this conversation. But in North America, that episode was very well received because it did touch on some sort of cultural common kind of understanding of Israel, and I think that again
If
over
there's
the
one
years.
song that North Americans know in Hebrew, it's
Right,
Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, right?
right. And it also, just to continue or answer your question, Ilana, in a slightly different way, it also, to a certain extent, dictated the stories that we could tell from here, because while our English language show doesn't only feature English speakers, it largely does, and that
Hmm.
means that you're telling the story of a certain segment of society here, um, and not telling the stories of other segments of society.
Hmm.
So we were very meticulous um, and conscientious about sort of our own blind spots. So we keep very detailed logs of who's getting airtime and who's not getting airtime on Israel, on Israel's story, both in terms of gender and age and socioeconomic status and education and stuff like that. And unsurprisingly, we see that in the English show, at least, we're interviewing a more educated, more Ashkenazi um, um, crowd than we perhaps would be in Hebrew.
There are parallels to that. That's one of the parallels I would say with the Canadian media or Canadian stories with English and French, is that oftentimes the Canadian French feel aggrieved because their stories aren't heard, and so the rest of Canada doesn't really understand Quebec, and a lot of it is because many Quebecers outside of Montreal don't speak English, and so their voices are not heard across the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
fascinating what you were describing. It's like you're doing a social experiment by accident of Jewry in Israel and then in the diaspora. I'm wondering, as you've worked on this podcast, I'm sure it's evolved a lot since you came up with the idea in 2011. Have you had any specific revelations about Israel for yourself or for anyone on your team that surprised you or shocked you about the country that you live in from doing all of these different stories? Do you have any particular one that stands out in your mind?
For sure, I would say that the greatest lesson that I've learned over the last decade of leading Israel's story is how different life is within a small country like Israel. And I thought that, well, I understood what life was like here, right? I thought that I had a pretty good idea of the questions people are asking themselves, the things they're interested in, the culture they're consuming, their daily routines, and so on and so forth. Because I thought, well, after all, I'm Israeli.
Mm-hmm.
I understand my life, or I hope to understand my life. So how different can it really be? And if I've learned one thing, it's that it is radically different. So what your life looks like if you're an ultra orthodox 19-year-old yeshiva boy in Bnei Brak, is so radically different than what your life looks like if you're a 19-year-old Palestinian girl living in East Jerusalem, which is so different from what your life looks like if you're a kibbutznik living in Emek Israel, or a Ethiopian, second generation Ethiopian living in Yerucham, or whatever it is. I mean, really, the way you perceive reality is just fundamentally different. And I often used to to see election results in Israel, and I would say, like, who are all these people who are voting in ways that are so different than the way I vote, and sort of where are they? I don't even see them, right? I mean, it's staggering to me always that, obviously the majority of the population votes for parties that I don't vote for. So I thought to myself, like, who are these people, and how come I'm not meeting them? Because everyone I kept on meeting was basically some sort of carbon copy of myself, right? I mean,
Right.
and I thought to myself, well, maybe in the army I'll meet them, but the army is not really the melting pot that it was sort of imagined to be by Ben Gurion, because you get into certain units and certain people get into certain units and others get into other units. So yes, you might meet people that you hadn't met till then, or kinds of people, but it's not really that much of a melting pot. And I thought, maybe driver's ed courses here are the real melting pot, because there's like a point system. If you have some sort of traffic violation, you get these negative points, and if you accrue enough of these negative points, then you have to like take a sort of remedial driving course. And since everybody accrues these points, I thought to myself, well, maybe that's where I'll meet these people. And it was true. I did meet, I don't know, Shas voters or whatever in that context. But the sort of most basic experience of working on Israel Story has been that it has allowed me to get to sort of step out of my own little bubble, my own little social bubble, which is obviously limited by my own circumstances in my own life. I was born into a specific city, in a specific neighborhood, into a specific family and stuff like that, and get to understand the real multiplicity of lives and ideas and realities that exist here.
I've always felt every time I go to Israel that one of the reasons why these various groupings live and keep separate is food is one of the great uniters, right? People will often meet over very famous or popular food places, restaurants, food stops, right? And Haredi society, ultra-Orthodox society in Israel decided long ago that the kosher isn't kosher enough for most of them. And they've created their own separate level of kosher, even though technically most every restaurant in Israel is kosher. And they don't eat with the other Israelis who are Jewish themselves. And so there's none of that mixing and mingling over the salatim, right? At the falafel place where you're stuffing your plate, you don't have that connection. You're not sitting and sharing that. And so you end up with much greater separation in society as a result of that. And that could have been potentially a great uniter, but it ended up not panning out.
Yeah,
that's my theory.
Interesting. I mean, that's definitely true in terms of the divide between ultra-Orthodox.
I mean, how often do you go to a place that is like Mahadran kosher, that is like super kosher? You're not that often probably going to a place. I mean, it's not that you're avoiding those places, but you're not particularly looking for those places.
Yeah, I have ultra-Orthodox cousins who invited me not long ago to a meal on Shabbat, and I asked what I could bring, and I thought that they were going to say nothing because my house isn't kosher enough for them. And to my surprise, he said, "Well, you can bring something for the kids to nosh." So I said, "Oh, okay. Well, what should I bring?" And he said, "Oh, bring whatever you want. Just make sure it has the following hechsherim, which are sort of stamps of various different kosher rabbinic authorities." And he sent me this PDF with 6 different hechsherim, and I asked him, do they need to have
all 6?
All 6, or is just one okay? And he said, no, one's okay, but they were such specific hechsherim that I had to go to like many, many different supermarkets around town to find these specific hechsherim. So
you brought up elections before, and here's a question that I want to ask you as a human interest question. This is not a politics. You're apolitical, but if you were an Israel Story,
I mean, I myself am not apolitical.
The show itself, anyways. Yes. But maybe you can help us think about this. So, if I was the host, I'd be asking you this on Canada Israel Story, right? We're going through an election right now in Canada, and it's an election that universally, most people will tell you nobody wants. It's an election that the ruling party decided to call because they thought that they can take a minority government and turn it into a majority government. This is a story that you've heard in Israel many times. And people are starting to get disillusioned about this process, about the nature of, elections. You guys have just gone through, what, 4 elections in 2 years.
Right.
How do you, as a person, as a voter, as a part of the process, not lose faith in the process, in the system of democracy, when you see that there are systemic problems within the system? What would you tell me as a Canadian voter, how to not lose faith? Because we saw that Israelis went back to the polls time and time and time again, even though the chances of a change happening were so slim and that things were likely going to remain the same. What do you tell me as a voter, as a participant in the democratic process? What have you learned as an Israeli?
Yeah, Israel's a small place. There's a real palpable sense that any given administration, or in other words, your own vote can really impact your life in some sort of immediate way, which perhaps is a little bit more abstract in large democracies like Canada or the U.S. It's true that we have a relatively high participation rate in elections. I'm always surprised that it's not higher. I wonder, like, who are the people who say, like, oh, I can't trouble myself to go and vote. I mean, I don't actually know the figures, but I think we're roughly 70% of people go to vote on any
somewhat similar to Canada.
Any election day. We do have a high voting rate, and I think that does have to do with the fact that there's a real sense that your vote matters.
Do you think there's something about the fact that Israelis really are tied up with their identity is tied up with who they vote for, similar to Americans, less so than what I would say in Canada? But you find that the Likud voter is really a Likudnik, and the Shasnik is really a Shasnik, and people really feel like they have to represent whatever fringe party or large party they have.
Well, the Israeli political system is a multi-party system, so you have
same here in Canada, yeah.
So you have all kinds of sort of identity politics going on, and you have a lot of people who don't really care about I don't know, let's say the Israeli-Palestinian issue at all, but are extremely committed to voting for their party because they belong to a certain social group. Their rabbis tell them to vote for a certain party, so that's what they do. They vote for that party, or it's not only the Orthodox. It's all kinds of groups that feel as if they want their representation.
So I'm going to jump in. I stole Melissa's old line. And take it back to the podcast. Avi really wanted to talk about politics with you, but I'm curious, just before we wrap it up, I have 2 quick questions for you. On your podcast, do you have a favorite episode that you've done? And then, unrelated to your podcast, what is your favorite podcast that you're listening to right now?
So as to our own favorite, my favorite podcast of our own episodes, we just released episode 67 in English. And in some very fundamental way, I feel like each one of those 67 episodes was like a child. We work on episodes for a very, very long time. We follow characters for months, and in certain cases, even for years. Every episode goes through countless drafts, and by the time it gets released into the world, I've heard each one hundreds of times. So literally, that's not like a figure of speech. So it's really always very hard for me to choose, and therefore my sort of go-to answer on that question is always that, like, I'm most interested in what the last thing I worked on, and the very last episode we released just yesterday was our first episode of the season, in which we took our entire team of producers to the Jerusalem YMCA, which is this oasis of coexistence and different groups meeting each other and mingling together in the kindergarten and in the sports center, and the hotel, and so on and so forth. And we spent an entire day there just talking to patrons, to staff, to kids, to people working out. And what I think the result is, what I think the results became was a collage of what Jerusalem, in all of its sort of difficulty and different layers, sounds like. And added upon that is sort of an institution trying to regroup after a year and a half of being closed for COVID. And we had just, the day we spent there was June 7th, 2021. So it was about, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks or something after the end of the last cycle of violence here. So that ended up being sort of, as you might expect, that ended up being a major theme. So I would say at the moment that is my favorite episode. If we talk next week, it will probably be our next episode. I listen to many podcasts, as you can imagine. Of course, to many of the podcasts that got us into the podcasting world, The Moth, and Radio Lab, and 99% Invisible, and This American Life. Big fan of Jonathan Goldstein, some Canadian
Good Montrealer,
and his Heavyweight podcast. I also, as everyone, have my own sort of idiosyncratic interests. So I listen to all kinds of esoteric things about archaeology and about basketball trades and whatever things that just happen to interest me. Now that we're in season, it's sort of podcast listening goes in cycles.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you're listening to your own episodes hundreds of times, where do you find time to listen to all these podcasts?
Right.
So I had a professor in graduate school that said when he was writing, he would never read anybody else's work because A, he didn't have time, and B, he wanted his voice to be his voice. And
right, it's always a difficult thing. I mean, when you're deep in production and you listen to a podcast, it's often difficult to just enjoy it as a listener, and instead of thinking like, oh, they brought the music in a bit too early, or they really should have raised that sentence by 3 dBs or whatever it is. But I try to sort of disconnect and just enjoy it as anyone would enjoy a podcast.
So usually after our main segment, I bring in a rabbi for a short word of wisdom of the week from across Canada. What I'd like to do, if you can close us off, instead of having a rabbi come on, we're right in the middle of the Chagim, right? The Yamim Noaim, the days of awe, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Is there a moment of transformation, a moment of lesson that you learned from your 67 episodes, or even the more from the Hebrew side, about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur that you found inspiring for your own Judaism as an Israeli, or however you define, that you would want to share with everybody around this time?
Wow. So I'm definitely no rabbi.
I am, so don't worry.
I think that in some fundamental level, what I've learned over the course of all this creative project is, on the one side, how, as I was saying earlier, fundamentally different we really are from each other, and based on our own circumstances, which often have little to do with anything that we ever did for ourselves or chose. And then at the same time, how, and I realized sort of the contradictory nature of this, but how similar we really are in fundamental ways, that we're motivated by the same kind of passions and jealousies and feelings of love and hate and friendship and loyalty and stuff like that, and there's something deeply humanizing about that, to realize that doesn't really matter if you're rich or poor, or Palestinian or Israeli, or live in Eilat or in Kiryat Shmona, but there's something there that can recognize yourself in other people, and I think that's why people also like listening to the show, because they can recognize themselves in or variations on themselves in other people.
Beautiful. I couldn't have said it better myself. I think that.
Well, I'm sure you could, since.
Well, here, the piece I would add to that is that, to me, what you just said is the humanist version of Unitane Tokef, right? The idea that on Rosh Hashanah everybody gets judged and everything happens, but everybody's passions and everybody's decisions and everybody's end product is all the same, and we're all human. And that's, one can take it from the God level from above, or one can look at it from a human level, flat across. And Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is the flattening of human society, and that's what Israel Story absolutely does for Israel, I think. So
There you
I
go.
thank you
And
for
we had a
making it.
rabbi sermon in the end.
Thank God.
Our
thank
local podcast rabbi, Rabbi Avi Feingold.
Mishy, thank you so much for coming on Israel Story. Its sixth season has just launched. Check it out at israelstory.org. We'll put the link in the show notes. We'd love to have you on if there's another Canadian angle in the future, and maybe we'll do some sort of a crossover episode with some Canadian Israelis
With
at some
pleasure.
point in some way. Great to talk to you. And
Thanks so much. It was a real pleasure.
Ilana, we're at the point in our program where we like to share our nachas of the week, something that gives us joy and makes us feel good about our Judaism and our Canadianness and all the lovely, wonderful stuff that comes between those things. What's your nachas of the week, Ilana?
I'm going to do a shameless plug. TIFF starts today, and I wrote a little piece about the top 6 Jewish films that are premiering at the festival. I'm excited because it's my first time living in Toronto during TIFF. I have to start going through the times and seeing what I'm going to be able to attend in person or virtually. But I think it's super exciting, and there's a lot of really great films. Dear Evan Hansen is one of my favorite musicals of all time, and they just did a movie adaptation. And lots of Jewish people involved, Jewish lead, Jewish writer of the original musical. One of the musical composers is also Jewish. So even though it's not Jewish content, it has Jewish written all over it. And that's the one I am most excited about. What's your nachas this week?
Related to that, my family is really excited for the Apple TV launch of Come From Away, which has a Jewish hook in it as well.
Ooh,
coming out tomorrow.
Is that happening?
It's
Wow.
they did the way they did Hamilton, which they filmed us the stage
like the
version,
the
stage play of it. They're all
no way.
looking forward to that one, which apparently is out tomorrow.
Cool.
Yeah. I like the Newfoundland connection and the music in that one, but
the music is great. I still haven't seen the full production, but I've listened to the soundtrack many times.
Yeah,
good to know. I didn't know about that.
I did my first seeing of a real play after seeing the stage version of it when I saw Springsteen on Broadway a few weeks ago. I was in New York for one day. Did I tell you about this?
Wow.
That was weird, being
no.
shoulder to shoulder, right? They really were strict, required double masks, required double vaccination, required masks while seated. But I'm a huge Springsteen fan, and I was in New York for one day, and I got to see Springsteen on Broadway, and I'd only seen it on Netflix before. This was it's in a tiny theater.
Yeah.
It's transcendent, really religious experience, really emotional, big deal.
Cannot wait to be back in the theater.
But sitting shoulder to shoulder with 1,000 strangers,
wow,
very strange.
I don't know how I would feel about that. We'll see. I have tickets to a show coming to Toronto in February, but we'll see if it happens or not because they're coming in from the US. It's from another podcast. Oh my God, I am blanking right now. Smartless. With Jason Bateman, Will Arnett, and Sean Hayes. They're doing a live tour of their podcast. Mm-hmm. And it's my favorite podcast. So I got tickets to that. But we'll see whether it comes through or not based on how COVID goes in the winter.
And stay tuned in 2022 for the live tour of Bonjour Chai, of course, coming across Canada. We'll be barnstorming, hopefully. You, me, and whoever our new host is. Right, Ilana? You're down for that?
Okay, let's do it. Why not?
Coming to the JCCs around you. Anyways, my nachas of the week. Yom Kippur is coming up. The obvious connection that I always think about with the high holidays with Leonard Cohen, of course, he of blessed memory and of Montreal fame, is the famous song that he adapted from the High Holiday Liturgy, Who by Fire, and it always comes up around here. But to me, the bigger, more profound, interesting connection, or not as heralded, and you can find the story online in multiple places, is that during the Yom Kippur War, he was so moved and really so touched by what was going on in Israel, and he felt the need to help out and to do something, that he actually went to Israel to entertain the troops in the Sinai Desert. And that story is available online. There is photographs of it. There's even footage that I saw at the Leonard Cohen exhibit, which was at the Montreal Contemporary Art Museum, and which is now in the Jewish Museum in New York, or went. It's on tour wherever now, and I think that there is footage of him performing in the desert with the soldiers around, and it's really like it was a Yom Kippur miracle, right, in the war sense, but also seeing this, Canadian who felt the need to say, I got to do something, and this was his way of contributing to doing something for the Israel cause at the time. So check out that story. It's a really cool story. Leonard Cohen and the Yom Kippur War.
Very cool. I'm going to have to check that out. Something for our listeners to be aware of, the CJN is now offering admission into the CJN Circle. So what does that mean? It means if you sign up, you get home delivery of the quarterly magazine, you get exclusive weekly emails, and invitations to live and virtual events. You can check all of that out at the cjn.ca/circle. All the details to get involved.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for Thursday, September 9th. Our producer is Michael Freeman. Technical production is by Andre Goulet. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our new page at thecjn.ca/bonjour. And you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do leave a comment and a rating, though, on the platform of your choice. I'm Avi Feingold.
And I'm Ilana Zakon.